On a gloomy day that marked the last of the school year, the students of Elmwood High were buzzing with the excitement of summer. However, one student, Mara, felt an unsettling chill as she stepped into the school building, a sense of foreboding clouding her usually cheerful demeanor. Mara's day began ordinarily, with final exams and yearbook signings, but as the hours ticked by, her anxiety grew. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong. During lunch, she overheard a group of teachers whispering frantically in the corner of the cafeteria. The words lockdown and not a drill caught her attention, but before she could process it, the announcement came. The principal's voice cracked through the intercom, instructing all students to proceed to the nearest classroom and lock the doors. No explanation was given, only urgent commands. Mara and her classmates scrambled into their history classroom, the heavy door thudding shut behind them. As the classroom darkened and the blinds were drawn, Mara sat huddled with her classmates, listening to the eerie silence that enveloped the school. The air was thick with tension and fear. Minutes felt like hours as they waited, listening for any sign of what was happening outside. Then, they heard it, a series of soft, dragging steps in the hallway, accompanied by a strange, raspy breathing that seemed to grow louder as it neared their classroom. The teacher held a finger to her lips, signaling everyone to be silent. The steps stopped right outside their door, and a shadow loomed through the glass panel above them. The door handle jiggled slightly, then started shaking violently as if someone, or something, was trying to gain entry. The students held their breath, too afraid to move, too terrified to even whisper. The shaking stopped abruptly, and was replaced by a haunting, childlike voice singing an eerie nursery rhyme. The words were muffled, but the tune was unmistakable and chilling. Just as suddenly as it had begun, the singing stopped. The silence returned, but the fear remained, heavier than before. Mara's heart raced as she exchanged frightened glances with her classmates. They were trapped, unsure of the danger lurking on the other side of the door, their fates unknown. And then, in the silence that followed, the intercom clicked on once more. But this time, instead of the principal's voice, there was only static, and then, a whisper, barely audible, sending chills down everyone's spine, come out, wherever you are." The static on the intercom crackled ominously before cutting out completely, plunging the classroom into a tense silence once more. Mara and her classmates exchanged nervous glances, each one of them too afraid to speak or even breathe too loudly. The air felt heavier, charged with a palpable sense of dread. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the hallways, sounding like a locker slamming shut, followed by the soft, eerie melody of the nursery rhyme once again. This time, it was louder, clearer, and unmistakably coming from multiple voices. It seemed as if invisible children were slowly circling their classroom, their voices weaving in and out of each other in a haunting lullaby. The teacher, Ms. Thompson, mustered her courage and whispered to the class, "Stay quiet, stay down," as she slowly edged toward the classroom phone. She picked up the receiver, her hands trembling, and dialed the main office, but all she heard was static. The lines were dead. Meanwhile, Mara, who was seated near the window, peeked through a small gap in the blinds. The schoolyard was deserted, the overcast sky casting a dreary shadow over the empty playground. But then, something caught her eye, a figure standing by the school's entrance, dressed in an old-fashioned school uniform, barely discernible in the dim light. The figure stood still, watching, waiting. Mara pulled back quickly, her heart pounding. She whispered to the person next to her, "There's someone outside." The classroom door rattled again, more insistently this time. The strange childlike singing continued, now accompanied by a soft tapping on the glass. "Let us in, let us in, let us in," the voices sang, over and over, in a hypnotic rhythm. Ms. Thompson backed away from the phone, her eyes wide with fear. "We have to block the door," she said in a hushed tone. The students scrambled, pushing desks and chairs against the door, fortifying their makeshift barricade with shaking hands. As they worked, the lights in the classroom flickered and then went out completely, enveloping them in darkness. The only light now came from the stormy sky outside, casting eerie shadows across the room. The tapping on the glass grew louder, more desperate. Suddenly, a loud crack shattered the silence as the glass in the door's window pane cracked. A cold wind blew through the small opening, carrying with it the chilling laughter of children. The intercom buzzed to life again, this time louder than before. The static cleared, and a deep, distorted voice boomed through the speakers, "Time to play." The voice was followed by a loud, mechanical whirring sound, like that of an old film projector starting up. In the dark, the outlines of figures appeared projected on the walls of the classroom, shadowy silhouettes of children, their movements jerky and unnatural as they played an eerie game of Ring Around the Rosie. Mara felt a cold draft as the temperature in the room dropped, her breath visible in the air. She clutched her arms around herself, feeling the eyes of the shadowy children on her, hearing their whispers creeping into her mind, "Join us, join us, join us." The fear was palpable, the threat imminent, and their escape uncertain. What lay beyond the classroom was unknown, but inside, the terror was all too real. The oppressive cold continued to seep into the classroom, the shadows on the walls twirling faster as the ghostly children's game grew more frenzied. Mara's eyes darted around the room, catching glimpses of her classmates, their faces illuminated intermittently by the flickering of the overhead light that struggled against the encroaching darkness. Ms. Thompson's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding despite her visible fear. "Everyone, get to the corner, away from the windows and door," she instructed. As the class huddled together, the room felt smaller, the walls closing in as the spectral laughter of the children echoed around them. Suddenly, a loud crash resonated through the school, silencing the laughter and momentarily pausing the shadow play on the walls. The eerie silence that followed was broken by heavy, uneven footsteps approaching the classroom. The barricade against the door shuddered as something slammed against it from the outside. Mara held her breath, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles turned white. Without warning, the projector-like images flickered and shifted, transforming the playful shadows into a grotesque parade of distorted figures, their limbs elongated and faces twisted in expressions of pain and malice. The figures seemed to reach out towards the children, their fingers almost piercing the very air of reality. In the corner of the room, one of Mara's classmates, Ethan, began whispering fervently to himself, his eyes unfocused, as if he could see something that others couldn't. "They want us to follow them," he murmured, his voice gaining an unsettling certainty. "They want us to play their game, forever." Ms. Thompson tried to comfort him, but Ethan suddenly stood up, moving towards the door with a strange determination. Mara reached out, grabbing his arm in a futile attempt to hold him back. "Ethan, no! It's not safe," she pleaded. Ignoring her, Ethan pressed his face against the small cracked window of the door, peering out. The temperature dropped further, frost forming on the inside of the glass as his breath fogged it up. His voice was a mere whisper, yet everyone heard him clearly, "They're here." The power surged back, flooding the classroom with harsh fluorescent light, casting stark shadows behind each desk and chair. The abrupt light revealed that the figures projected on the walls were no longer just harmless shadows, they had depth and appeared almost solid, turning towards the huddled students with a menacing intent. Before anyone could react, the door burst open, sending desks and chairs skittering across the floor. A gust of freezing wind rushed in, carrying with it leaves and twigs as though it had traveled through the forest. Standing in the doorway was not a person or creature, but a dense, dark fog that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It hovered momentarily, then slowly rolled into the room, enveloping everything in its path. The children screamed, scrambling away from the advancing fog, but it moved unnaturally, splitting and twisting to corner them. Ms. Thompson grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall, aiming it at the fog, but as she discharged it, the mist seemed to swallow the cloud of chemicals, unharmed and undeterred. Mara's heart pounded in her ears as she backed into the far corner of the room with her remaining classmates. The cold was biting now, numbing her fingers and toes. The fog continued to advance, and as it touched the first of her classmates, he let out a scream that was abruptly silenced, his figure becoming a shadow within the mist. As the fog drew nearer, Mara looked around desperately for any form of escape or defense. Her eyes landed on the old ventilation grate above the storeroom door. It was small and high, but it might be their only chance. The vent, she yelled over the din of terrified cries, pointing towards it. "We need to get up there." With no time to lose, the students frantically stacked chairs and desks beneath the ventilation grate. The mist swirled closer, its tendrils creeping along the floor, curling around the furniture, and stretching towards the terrified students. Mara boosted her classmate, Lucas, up first, urging him to pry open the grate quickly. His fingers fumbled with the screws, his movements hastened by the chilling screams of another classmate enveloped by the fog. The grate clanged loudly as it hit the floor, and Lucas scrambled up into the dark shaft, turning to help the others. Mara directed the younger students to go next, her heart pounding as she watched the fog roll closer, its form now swirling menacingly, almost with purpose. Ms. Thompson assisted the students, lifting them as they climbed, her face set with a grim determination. As Mara prepared to climb, she glanced back at Ethan, who stood still by the window, his expression distant, as if mesmerized by the chaos. "Ethan, come on," she yelled, reaching at her hand. But he shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving the fog. "It's too late for me, go," he murmured, his voice a resigned whisper. Reluctantly, Mara turned and hoisted herself into the vent, feeling the cold metal against her skin. Behind her, the room was fading into a dense white as the fog filled every corner, obscuring her view. She could hear Ms. Thompson urging Ethan one last time before a final, resigned silence fell over the room. Inside the ventilation shaft, the air was stale, and the space was cramped. Lucas led the way, the beam from his cell phone light cutting through the darkness. The metal ducts rattled under their weight, echoing their movements through the empty school. The group crawled through the labyrinthine network of ducts, the sound of their own breathing loud in the confined space. Every turn and junction brought them further from the classroom but offered no hint of safety or escape. Mara's mind raced with fear for those left behind and worry about what they would find at the end of this desperate escape route. Suddenly, a sharp noise pierced the silence, a metallic scraping sound followed by a thud. The students froze. The noise came again, closer this time, as if something, or someone, was navigating the ductwork behind them. Lucas whispered back, "We need to keep moving. Whatever it is, it's following us." The urgency in his voice spurred them on, pushing through the fear that clutched at their hearts. They emerged from the ventilation shaft into the dimly lit library, dust motes floating in the air disturbed by their sudden entrance. The room was silent, the only sound the distant thunder of what might have been footsteps or perhaps the echoes of their own past movements. As they gathered in the shadows of the bookshelves, Mara peered out into the hallway through the library doors. The hall was shrouded in darkness, the only light a flickering fluorescent bulb at the far end. The school seemed deserted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Deciding they couldn't stay hidden forever, Mara led the group toward the main entrance, each step tentative, listening for any sign of the strange occurrences they had fled from. As they approached the front doors, a cold wind swept through the broken panes, the night air smelling of rain and earth. Just as they reached for the doors, a chilling sound stopped them, soft, almost inaudible at first, the same eerie nursery rhyme they had heard before, now whispering through the corridors. The realization hit them with numbing fear, the nightmare was far from over. Hesitating at the main entrance, Mara and the remaining students paused as the haunting melody weaved through the air, its origins unclear but unmistakably closer than before. The melody seemed to emanate from all around them, enveloping the school in its spectral grip. Lucas, his face pale under the flickering lights, whispered urgently, "We can't go out that way. It's like it's everywhere outside." He pointed to the rear exit that led towards the school's gymnasium, suggesting a less direct, hopefully safer route to the outside. The group, their nerves frayed, silently agreed, turning away from the whispering darkness at the front doors and making their way down the hallway towards the gym. Their footsteps echoed in the empty corridors, the sound unnervingly loud in the oppressive silence. As they neared the gym, the familiar cold draft greeted them, and with it, a subtle shift in the air pressure. Mara felt her ears pop slightly, a sign that the atmospheric changes were not just limited to temperature. The door to the gym creaked as they pushed it open, revealing the vast, shadow-filled space. Inside, the gym seemed transformed. The bleachers were pushed back against the walls, and the overhead lights were shattered, glass glittering like stars against the dark floor. The moonlight streaming through the high windows cast long, reaching shadows, creating the illusion of movement in the corners of the room. The nursery rhyme grew louder, now clearly echoing within the gym's walls. The students froze, scanning the dark corners and the high ceilings for any sign of movement. Suddenly, the shadows shifted, elongating and twisting into humanoid figures that began to slowly descend the walls, their movements unnatural, as if not bound by the laws of physics. Mara grabbed a discarded basketball pole, wielding it like a staff. "Stay close," she instructed, her voice a low whisper, betraying a mix of fear and determination. The group formed a tight circle in the center of the gym, their backs to each other, watching as the shadowy figures approached, creeping closer with every pulse of the haunting melody. Just then, a loud crash echoed through the gym as one of the side doors burst open, wind and rain pouring in. The sudden disturbance seemed to momentarily confuse the shadowy figures, their forms flickering uncertainly. Seizing the opportunity, Mara shouted, "Run to the door! Now!" The students sprinted towards the open door, the cold rain slapping against their faces as they burst out into the stormy night. The schoolyard was a blur of rain and darkness, the storm having transformed the familiar landscape into an almost unrecognizable terrain of mud and swirling leaves. They ran across the school field, slipping and sliding in the mud, driven by the primal urge to escape. Behind them, the shadows did not follow into the rain, instead, they lingered at the edge of the building, as if bound to the structure itself. Reaching the edge of the school property, the group found themselves at the old service road that wound its way through the woods surrounding the school. The path home was fraught with new dangers, the woods known for their dense undergrowth and the occasional creek that swelled dangerously during storms. Mara led the way, her makeshift staff held ready, her mind racing with plans and contingencies. As they entered the tree line, the wind howled through the branches, the trees bending as if in pain. The storm obscured their vision, but the path forward was their only option. In the darkness of the woods, the rain muffled all sounds, leaving them in a bubble of eerie silence. But then, a faint sound cut through the noise of the storm, a laugh, high and chilling, it seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The realization dawned on Mara and the others, the horror of Elmwood High was not confined to the school. It had followed them into the woods, into the storm, continuing their nightmarish last day of school beyond the walls that once promised safety. As Mara and the group ventured deeper into the woods, the storm above them raged with increasing ferocity, the trees bending unnaturally as if tormented by unseen forces. The laughter that had followed them out of the school was now joined by whispers, the words indistinguishable but saturated with malice. Pushing forward, the students' fear was palpable, each shadow and noise causing them to jump. The path, muddy and treacherous underfoot, sloped downward, leading them to an old bridge that crossed a swollen creek. The wood creaked ominously as they stepped onto it, the rushing water below barely visible through the storm. As they reached the midpoint of the bridge, the laughter ceased abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence that was somehow more terrifying. The rain seemed to pause, the air still, and in that moment of eerie calm, a figure appeared before them on the bridge. It was Ethan, or what remained of him, his eyes hollow, his skin pale and damp. "Ethan?" Mara called out hesitantly, her heart sinking. The figure smiled, a twisted, painful smile. "You can't escape," he whispered, his voice echoing unnaturally over the water. "It wants to play forever, with all of you." Realizing escape was no longer an option, Mara tightened her grip on the staff. "We won't play its game," she declared, her voice resolute despite the trembling fear. The other students rallied behind her, their own fears momentarily stilled by her courage. Ethan's form flickered, like a bad television signal, before stabilizing. "Then it will come for you, again and again, in dreams and in waking, until you have no will left." "We'll find a way to stop it," Mara responded, stepping forward. She swung the staff with all her might, connecting with the apparition. Ethan's figure dissipated like mist, a scream echoing in the air as the storm resumed its fury. The group hurried across the bridge, reaching the other side as the structure groaned and collapsed into the creek, swept away by the raging water. Behind them, the woods seemed to scream in anger, the darkness deepening. They continued running until the woods began to thin, the first rays of dawn piercing the darkness. As they emerged from the tree line, the school and the horrors within felt like a distant nightmare. But the relief was short-lived as they realized they were standing in front of an old, abandoned building, the original Elmwood High, shuttered and forgotten decades ago. Mara felt a chill as she realized the horror might have roots deeper than they could have imagined, tied not just to the place but to the very spirit of Elmwood itself. They had escaped the immediate danger, but the true battle to sever the terror's ties to their lives was just beginning. Determined, Mara turned to her weary but alive friends. "We need to find out why it's attached to us, and how to end it for good. This is only the beginning." As they walked away from the dilapidated school, the sun rose fully, casting long shadows that seemed to whisper of dark secrets waiting to be uncovered. Mara knew their fight was far from over, but she also knew they had something no malevolent spirit could take away: hope in each other. And with that, they stepped forward, ready to face whatever lay ahead, bound by their shared ordeal and the resolve to protect their future from the horrors of the past.